September 17th. And something terrible has begun in Crimea.
Everything is exploding. It's just utter devastation.
Crowds of Russians are desperately rushing through the checkpoints in panic. Crush, chaos, panic. Tens of thousands are fleeing. Gunshots can be heard. A mass evacuation has begun.
These bastards, such explosions all over. They did hit the oil depot after all.
Russia is being rocked by new strikes. More than 500 drones attacked airfields and oil refineries.
A massive ton of fuel is currently burning. We are confirming there is a dangerous fire at our main oil depot. Traffic on Fedko Street is temporarily blocked. The Kerch Highway is partially closed.
Explosions in Saky, Kacha, and Belbek. At key military airfields and in the Krasnodar region. The Kremlin is hiding the disaster, but the situation is getting out of control. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan.
Drones attacked the occupied Crimea and Russia's Krasnodar region. Explosions were heard in Saky, Sevastopol, and in the areas around the Belbek airfield. More than 40 explosions. Evacuation has begun. And other units struck the Tuapse oil refinery in the Krasnodar region last night. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that they destroyed nearly 130 Ukrainian drones. Let's discuss all this with Roman Svitan, a well-known military analyst. Roman Nikolaevich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Nikolaevich, let's start on a positive note with our strikes on Russian territory and temporarily occupied Crimea. How do you assess the work of the Ukrainian armed forces?
Well, it's already clear. This is systematic work. Why is your focus on oil refineries and oil and gas pumping systems? Strikes were also carried out near Anapa, targeting a gas compressor station. Naturally, Tuapse as well. There in Tuapse is the Tuapse oil refinery, plus it has its own terminal, meaning there's a port and a terminal for transshipping hydrocarbons. And of course, nearby is Novorossiysk. There's a Russian port there. The Russian Black Sea Fleet is currently based there. Plus, there's a terminal for pumping Caspian oil that is from the so-called Caspian pipeline, not Kazakh oil. Well, they say it's Kazakh oil, although in reality it's Russian oil being substituted, of course, because further imposition of sanctions by the Ukrainian armed forces, if we can call it that. It's clear that the main intelligence directorate was the base here in this direction. But the number of drones, the sequence of task execution, several waves were organized. This was already the work of aviation. That is, most likely this involved the use of air forces. Why? Because that's practically how attacks are carried out using aerial strike means. That is, with airplanes, missiles, and aerial bombs. First, there was a wave of drones, so-called decoys, which drew the enemy's air defense onto themselves. And here the GUR did a great job. They first figured out the enemy air defense's operating algorithm, the locations of the anti-aircraft missile systems, and the number of missiles in each system. That's why they calculated everything so that the Russian SAM systems would practically fire off all the missiles they possibly could at a decoy drone, and then the strike drones came in equipped with serious, powerful warheads. Plus, several new missiles were also launched and accomplished their combat mission. So we can congratulate both our Air Force and the main intelligence directorate on a job well done. As for the Belbek airfield, since explosions were also heard there, are there any damages? What can you say about that? It's an area target, so naturally it was also hit. That's exactly how it was, pretty much the same everywhere. Some of the drones also went through Crimea, including those heading toward Novorossiysk. They went over the Sea of Azov, across the Black Sea, and through Crimea. So this was a large-scale attack that also made it possible to strike some targets in Crimea, the Belbek 1 airfield. These targets, although of course the task at this point hasn't been fully accomplished, because in order to expose and completely neutralize the airfield itself, they would have needed to work on the air defense systems as well, and for at least a week, because the air defense in Crimea is still quite strong. Well, the air defense is serious, meaning they managed to hit our drones there. Naturally, the debris landed exactly where it was supposed to. We already have a drone called Debris. That's so the Russians don't get confused. They themselves are already saying that debris has damaged this and that. But we confirm, yes, indeed, debris is flying around.
Yes, dear audience, please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much. In the comments, write where you're watching from and also a few words about where you're watching us from in support of Ukraine. Roman Nikolaevich, the reports say that 130 Ukrainian drones or their debris were all shot down, all destroyed. In your opinion, if we are attacking Russia with 100 to 150 drones, how much do we need to increase the numbers to attack more? What do you think we should do to be more effective?
The fact is, every system, whether it's a general system or, say, a site-specific system, has its own limitations. There is a certain saturation coefficient, meaning the number of missiles that can be launched within a specific period of time. After that, there is a reload period, which can take several minutes, sometimes tens of minutes, sometimes over an hour, depending on the capabilities. And only then can a second attack of roughly the same scale be intercepted. So, depending on the density of air defense at a given site, the necessary amount of forces and resources is calculated to break through the air defense system. This is called exceeding the saturation coefficient of that system at the given site. They are different everywhere. If, for example, there's a Panzer system stationed near some tank or, say, an oil refinery, that's 12 missiles. That is the 13th. Any flying object, the 13th will get through by default, because even if 12 missiles are launched, after the first 12 targets, there will be nothing left to shoot down the 13th. That's roughly how it works. I'm explaining it in simple terms. That's why you can't talk about the number of assets directly involved in the total number directly participating in the attack without knowing which targets, for example, the attack is being planned against. And about what? Depending on the target, depending on the density of air defense at that site, the calculation for the number of assets varies, starting from dozens of drones up to hundreds of drones, depending on the objectives. So we can say that we already have the capability to penetrate the enemy's defenses at any site. In other words, we have the ability to exceed the interception coefficient for almost any target the Russians are trying to cover, except for a few. They have three, you could say, targets that are very difficult to hit without ballistic missiles to carry out a strike on them. These are the Kerch Bridge, the Novorossiysk port, and Moscow. So those are the three targets. All the others we can already penetrate.
Roman Ilyich, so Lavrov has once again made statements in his usual manner, and in doing so has completely buried all of Trump's peace plans. What did Lavrov say? There will be no cessation of hostilities in Ukraine along the line of contact. We have a constitution, and he also added that Russia is against the deployment of peacekeepers. And literally the day before, Trump said that Putin had agreed to allow American and British troops to enter Ukrainian territory. In other words, there is a complete lack of understanding between the two sides, the American and the Russian. Given this, there is information emerging that the Ukrainian armed forces will advance on Belgorod because they understand that it is necessary to strengthen our positions as much as possible today. What do you think, Roman Grigorievich?
First of all, this is not a matter of mutual understanding between the countries. It's not between the countries, it's a misunderstanding between two chatterboxes, to be honest. One chatterbox is Trump, the other chatterbox is Putin. They just babble because the earth rotates, so it's night in one place and day in another, depending on who gets up when and who goes to bed when. That's what their babbling is about. Believe me, that's exactly how it is. They don't even remember what they said yesterday, unless it's tied to some basic things. Neither of them does. Lavrov, by the way, Lavrov is actually the one who speaks consistently. We call him Lavrokonenko, a bit in the Ukrainian style. This Lavrokonenko, he clearly demonstrates certain fundamental things beyond which you can't go. By the way, that's what's most interesting to us as well. There's such a concept as the legal framework of the constitution. So within the legal framework of the Russian constitution, 5 of our regions have been incorporated. The Crimean region should return to the unitary structure of the Ukrainian constitution. The Crimean region, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. These 5 regions have been incorporated according to their administrative borders, including the cities of Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and so on. And this is already within the legal framework of the Russian constitution. Statements or actions aimed, for example, at alienation or at not restoring or refusing to restore, and so on and so forth, including diplomatic return or anything else, are now subject to the Russian criminal code. Moreover, there are articles similar to our articles 110 and 111 in the area of state treason. There is a corresponding article there as well. That's why now not a single Russian citizen, not one, and especially not any official, meaning someone responsible for certain issues related to construction, will even dare to utter a word against the criminal code regarding stopping hostilities, freezing, halting, not advancing, or refusing to liberate territories that, according to the Russian constitution, are considered not yet free. Otherwise, they'll simply be imprisoned. If not this one, then another. And it doesn't matter who it will be. It will be Putin, or it will be Patrushev, or it will be Lavrov, or Kononenko, or someone else. Or maybe Shoigu will run over there to take the president's seat. There's nowhere for them to go anymore. In other words, they have no way out. What happened is that Putin, by exerting his control over Russian governance, has driven Russians into a trap from which there is only one way out: the collapse of the Russian Empire. It is impossible to change the legal framework of the Russian constitution to reduce its territory. It can only be dismantled, just like the Soviet Union collapsed. No one remembers the Soviet constitution anymore, or any requirements for the Soviet Union, because it simply doesn't exist. The same picture is happening here. There's no other way out of this situation. Now, Russians will be forced to spend the rest of their short lives fighting to restore Russia's borders from the perspective of the Russian constitution, trying, in their view, to liberate Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson regions. That's all there is to it. For them, this has become a quest that will last forever. So in this sense, Lavrokonenko is, of course, absolutely right from his point of view. From our point of view, the picture is exactly the same. That is, for us, our constitution naturally makes things simpler and easier for us internationally. We have internationally recognized borders. As for Russian borders, only a handful of those feeble, undying states recognize them, just a few countries, while our borders are internationally recognized. This is just like the latest UN vote. We talked about this before, that something like this would happen. It showed that only 18 countries supported the capitulation of Ukraine. In other words, the seizure of Ukrainian land by Russians, only 18 out of nearly 200 countries, which is less than 10%. Therefore, from the standpoint of the recognition of our borders and the legal framework of our constitution, we also have no right to give up our land. Any refusal or calls for refusal. Any refusal is Article 110 high treason, and calls for such refusal are also Article 110 high treason. When the refusal is formalized with signatures, and calls for such refusal are also covered under Article 110 as incitement. So essentially, we also cannot do this. We have no mechanism to give up our territory. Why? Because any person who refuses immediately falls under the third part of these two articles, which means life imprisonment with full confiscation. That's all there is to it, because here the situation will develop according to the only scenario currently possible. We need to restore our territory to the 1991 borders, and Russia needs to be dismantled. Why? Because even if we reach the 1991 borders, if we don't dismantle the Russian Empire, if we don't practically destroy the Russian constitution by breaking it apart, we still won't solve the issue. There simply won't be any peace agreements or negotiations. Both constitutions, they currently represent mutually exclusive things. So honestly, as for what Trump is thinking about, it seems like he might think about something if he had anything to think with. It really feels like there's nothing left to think with.
Good afternoon. Regarding the collapse of Russia, as you mentioned, additionally, the Ukrainian Armed Forces Aviation carried out a high-precision bombing strike on a border checkpoint. In the Bryansk region, a MiG-29 fighter jet from the 40th Air Force Brigade carried out a combat sortie. We are striking targets in the Bryansk region, and now everyone is writing, including Russian war correspondents, that the Bryansk region will be the next direction for the Ukrainian armed forces, especially considering General Syrskyi's statement that we may even launch offensive actions on Russian territory. What do you think, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, that's a border crossing, meaning the Russians have started to reinforce it, and they've strengthened it to such an extent that our intelligence, again, the main intelligence directorate, Army Intelligence, did a great job, really impressive, and reported that a rather serious group is gathering there, one that could break through our border in that direction. Naturally, an airstrike was carried out. They dropped the GBU-39 and eliminated that possibility for now, but it's still a border crossing. So it's practically right on the border. The actual incursion of our troops, if you can call it that, onto Russian territory is in principle possible in the near future, and not just in this direction. So I don't rule out the possibility, and not just in Bryansk, but also in the Belgorod region. In fact, to be honest, the Belgorod direction is even a bit more important for us in order to cover Kharkiv. First of all, we could push the Russians back by coming at them from the rear, targeting both the Lipetsk and Vovchansk Russian groupings. And also create a certain security zone for Kharkiv, because the borderline is just too close. As for the Bryansk direction, well, that's the objective if we're talking about the Belgorod direction. If it's the Bryansk direction, then the optimal option would be to move toward the Dashko oil pipeline. Just like we're currently controlling the gas pipeline on Russian territory near Sudzha, but that's a gas transfer point. And there, the Druzhba pipeline runs for about 40 kilometers in the Unecha area, near that same Mamai, and through Klimovo, you can head toward Mamai. You can move toward Vozipkovo. So this kind of movement is certainly possible in the Belgorod direction as well for such a task. Although the overall objective, of course, is the destruction of the enemy's army on its own territory, the creation of a certain security zone where militarized Russians themselves will denazify it, because otherwise they'll just bombard it with cabs. So there are definitely mechanisms, and they will certainly be used. Maybe that's even happening right now.
Roman Grigorievich, here's what the Wall Street Journal writes. It turns out that Trump's plan regarding Ukraine does not provide for US military support or assistance to Ukraine in the event that hostilities resume. Today, I also read an analyst's opinion that Trump has now officially stated there will be no more arms deliveries, no new contracts will be signed because he is focused on a peaceful track. How much will this affect the situation at the front? I'd like to ask you about this from a military perspective.
Well, let's say the absence of American supplies. Because the word assistance is such a vague concept. That is, does it mean purchasing weapons or the delivery of previously purchased or paid for arms? Or is it new deliveries without payment or new deliveries with payment? It's very complicated here. It's hard to determine what Trump is even talking about or whether he understands these mechanisms at all. So let's talk about the technical aspects. Right now, we're receiving American arms deliveries that were paid for last year or even the year before that. Why is that? Because Congress allocated the funds. It's not Trump or Biden who allocate them. They can only redistribute them somehow or increase them depending on the possibilities. They can speed things up or slow them down, but in reality, it's Congress that allocates the money, and it's the money of American taxpayers. And once the funds are allocated and paid for, naturally, all this movement will continue. That's why the deliveries of American weapons under the programs that have already been launched will continue for at least this year, meaning all the way through 2026. And basically, with the help of these deliveries, we can maintain the current intensity of fighting that we have at the moment without increasing it or planning offensive operations. That is, we can conduct defensive operations along the current line of contact for this year. But over the course of the year, of course, we'll need to plan for the next year, even without American involvement in this regard. If the Americans add something for us, let's say Trump says that he won't help us with anything. But help is, as I say, a broad concept. To provide it for free or, for example, under procurement agreements. The supplies to us could be made under British payment because Britain can buy as much weaponry as it basically wants. They have their own arrangements. I'm just saying this off the top of my head. So from the standpoint of ownership, the weapons could be considered British, although the certificate of manufacture, that is the certificate of origin, would be American. So that's also possible. So for now, with Trump, I think it's more about political maneuvers, some kind of pressure on our military and political leadership to make us rush, panic, and do something in a hurry out of fear. Some kind of peace agreements, or maybe it's one of the mechanisms to show Putin that there are at least some negotiable elements or at least some management of these negotiable aspects to demonstrate that he is also somehow trying to put pressure on Ukraine. That's more or less how it is. Overall, it's still more of a political statement. As far as
Nemalenki Igorevich, look, on February 27th in Istanbul, there will be a meeting between representatives of the US and Russia in Istanbul, which is very important. President Zelensky said that we need security guarantees from Turkey. That's also a very important statement. And again, on Friday, February 28th, President Zelensky is meeting with Trump, considering that Lavrov said that Russia is not considering any options involving the deployment of European troops, even though the British, Germans, and French are ready to withdraw them.
As always, Baba Yaga is against it. But what Lavrov is saying, those are just the maximum wish lists. These are the demands they start with in order to eventually reach some kind of middle ground. That's pretty much how it always happens. They voice their maximum vision and then the bargaining begins. But we should not take part in these negotiations. We should not participate in bargaining over our own territory, because any participation on our part in bargaining over our territory legitimizes that bargaining. In other words, we shouldn't be involved there at all. Where are the Americans and Russians going to meet? Frankly, that's their problem. I still don't understand why they keep meddling in Europe. Or say in Turkey, well, yes, part of it is in Europe, part in Asia. Why are they interfering in Europe? You know, between Russia and America, do you know how many kilometers there are between them? 3.6 kilometers, 3.6 kilometers, just two islands in the Bering Strait. And the width of the Bering Strait itself between Russia and Alaska, which is still American for now, it's 86 kilometers. So why are they flying tens of thousands of kilometers all the way to Istanbul? It's unclear what they want here. It's just not clear. Most likely, they're trying to resolve some issues in this region. What issues in this region? This is the Middle East. These are issues related to Palestine, Israel, Iran, Gaza, Syria, and so on and so forth. All these contacts aren't really about us. So why Istanbul? Because Turkey is currently controlling certain processes, at least in Syria at this moment. Israel has started bombing southern Syria. They're already beginning to take action. So this whole entanglement has only an indirect connection to Ukraine. Most likely, Ukraine is just being used as a cover right now for all this chaos in the Middle East. That's what I see at the moment. We shouldn't show up there under any circumstances, just absolutely not show up at all, no contacts whatsoever. If anywhere there's talk about dividing up our territory, well, that's our 110th, 111th. Those who come here to divide up our territory, to tear it apart or whatever, they might show up in Ukraine and counterintelligence will say, hello, good evening, we're from Ukraine. That's about how it would go. And then arm in arm by the hand straight to Malyuk's office. Believe me, he won't beat anyone. He'll just sit down. Anyone who's seen Malyuk knows perfectly well. He won't force confessions out of anyone. He'll just sit down and people will tell everything themselves. That's more or less how it'll go if anyone tries to come here. So let them sort things out themselves in their own Middle Eastern ecstasy. And as for Erdogan, he'll definitely take charge here. I mean, Erdogan is a real warrior, a fighter who will now be pushing his own interests in the Middle East at the very least. That's why Lavrov was running around at first. There will be Americans there, someone else joined in, and what was Zelensky doing there? Well, most likely he was just passing through, as they say, doing his own thing. But once again, Erdogan confirmed our territorial integrity. And we are very grateful to him for that. Because Turkey helps us a great deal, a truly significant amount. They don't go around shouting about it. And they don't brag about building some kind of sanatorium or a field hospital, treating everyone there and then packing it all up and leaving. They simply don't do that. The Turks are directly involved in supplying ammunition, equipment, production, and determining logistics chains. Now that's real help. And especially without any demands in return. For example, you haven't heard the Turks making any claims on our mineral resources or anything like that, and that's worth noting. They understand perfectly well that we are in trouble right now and are helping us, obviously expecting that we will help them in return, and we definitely will.
Roman Igorovich, President Zelensky said that immediately after he visits Washington and meets with Trump, as I understand it, agreements will be signed on Friday. The agreement regarding rare earth minerals, he will immediately fly to London, where he will meet with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, and other Europeans. Most likely, they will be discussing the introduction of this peacekeeping contingent, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. First, I want to ask you, what is your opinion on this rare earth minerals deal? For now, we understand that most likely security guarantees must be in place because Prime Minister Shmyhal said that they definitely will be. Without them, this deal will not be signed.
Shmyhal often lies, to be honest, and in this case, that's definitely true. Why? Because the only real security guarantee is the restoration of our nuclear status, nothing more. Everything else is just a piece of paper. And I'm saying it wrong on purpose. Just a piece of paper, just like the Budapest Memorandum, nothing more. Any security guarantee is just a piece of paper, one that won't protect you, that won't shield you from an Iskander missile. That's why restoring nuclear status, having our own army, a professional army, and the complete collapse of the Russian Empire, just like what happened to the Soviet Union, those are the real security guarantees for Ukraine. And everything else is just paper that politicians try to sign. Those same politicians were running around with these papers 30 years ago. I remember it well. I was 30 years old then. It was 1994. I remember it. I was born in 64. So now another 30 years have passed, and it's pretty much the same picture as back then. They were running around with these papers when our nuclear status was taken away from us. We gave up so much, and now all of it is coming back at us, from missiles to airplanes, and we gave up our nukes too. So now it's the same story. New, young, inexperienced politicians are trying to sell us this same piece of paper. Back then, it was Kuchma and Kravchuk who sold it, and I think both of them should be turning in their graves at the speed of sound at least. Time must slow down for them now. These so-called green politicians who are trying to sell us this piece of paper, they can use it for themselves. That's about all it's good for. So when it comes to security guarantees, let Shmihal and the others save their stories. Shmihal, and especially Shmihal with his Shmai hat nonsense. But the idea itself, for example, of inviting investors here, well, it's actually not a bad idea, generally speaking, as long as certain fundamental conditions are met, the ones set out in our constitution. According to our constitution, the people of Ukraine are the sole owners of the land and of the mineral resources found in it. And when they start to receive the benefits from that, every Ukrainian should receive their share of the rent, their portion from the use of mineral resources and land, directly to their bank card, including from the use of land plots. Only then can we talk about any kind of investment appeal or investment topics at all. Until that happens, all of this is just empty talk, political, geopolitical, or whatever else. What it's needed for is still unclear. They're trying to push it through somehow, but there will definitely be no further action on these documents. When the next government comes, one that's for the people, a military one, this will all be over. A cross will be put on it, and we'll forget about these agreements entirely, at least until we create this basic framework for every Ukrainian. After that, we'll talk to investors who are interested in extracting our mineral resources. There simply is no other option. That's one. And second, what really caught my eye, and I really didn't like, is that they're creating an investment fund for the future reconstruction of Ukraine. But wait, Ukraine should be rebuilt at the expense of Russian reparations. So what does this mean? They're immediately putting a cross on Russian reparations. What kind of investment fund for Ukraine's reconstruction is that? First comes victory, first the destruction of Russia, its collapse, and then certain reparations demands to the territories into which Russia will break up. That's what real reconstruction will be. So here, it's obvious they just cobbled something together from what was at hand. And then, as the saying goes, you end up loving what you have. That's basically it. They're trying to push this through so that the Ukrainian people will come to love all this nonsense, but it won't work.
A peacekeeping contingent on the territory of Ukraine, Roman Lvovich, is what, as I understand it, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom are currently proposing.
It all depends on the goal. What is the purpose of these so-called darlings? And I can't call any European country anything else. They don't have armies. Practically none of them have forces that could act as peacekeepers and not run away from our territory if the Russians suddenly start shooting. Well, for now, they're just darlings. Maybe there will be a few thousand of them and you can use them, yes, along the border with Belarus in places where no one will ever shoot. So these darlings, they could be stationed there, about 30,000 of them, along 1,000 kilometers of the front. But in this role, if they prove themselves, they will free up several dozen of our brigades, which is several tens of thousands of our servicemen, mainly from the National Police, the National Guard, and Border Guards, who could now reinforce our Eastern Front. This is very important for us. So for this kind of task, by all means, even these darlings can handle it there. And everything else is pure fantasy. No one is going to station them on the front line or even close to the front line. They won't get anywhere near it, and there's no need to drag them there.
As always, we ask our audience to like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Roman Svitan and I try to cover the key military events twice a week, so please support our content. Leave a comment, write a few warm words in support of Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces, and also let us know where you're watching from. This is our informational front. The well-known analyst Roman Svitan, Roman Igorevich, thank you, and as always, see you soon.